Hi everyone, my name is Megan Flynn and I will be going through the rest of Chapter 1 from our Concepts of Biology OpenStax textbook, which can be accessed for free using that website openstax.org. For this chapter, I've already gone through the first part of the chapter, so if you missed that chapter, go ahead and click that subscribe button so that you can access the playlist that has that first video. So in this video, I'm going to be covering the second part of Chapter 1. So themes and concepts of biology, we've already done. The second half of the chapter from the OpenStax textbook gets into how we do science, so the process of science. So we'll get into that next. So by the end of this video, you should be able to identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences. You should also be able to understand the process of scientific inquiry, compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning, as well as describe the goals of the basic science and applied science. So that's what we're going to be covering in this video. And it's actually 1.2, not 1.1, sorry about that up there. So when we're getting into the science of biology, we need to understand, well, what is science? So science is knowledge that covers general laws or truths, general truths or the operation of general laws, especially when acquired and tested by the scientific method. So when we're studying something in science, we're basically trying to observe our surroundings and use those observations or maybe data from an experiment to come up with some sort of conclusion. So this involves the scientific method. So what is the scientific method? The scientific method is a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. So science, we use the scientific method to address something we want to learn about. We can't just come up with a solution without testing it first. So science involves that step-by-step process. All right. Now within the scientific method, we will be coming up with a proposed explanation for whatever we are addressing or trying to explain. So for example, if I am noticing in my environment that the plants that are exposed to the most sunlight are growing the best. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm noticing compared to the plants in the shade. So I might come up with a hypothesis that explains that, why I'm noticing plants that are in the sun are better than the ones that are growing in the shade. They're growing faster. So I can come up with that hypothesis that it says that, the sun is allowing these plants to grow better than the ones in the shade. So the plants that are growing in the sun, they will be using that sunlight to allow them to grow. So that's an example of a hypothesis. It's a suggested explanation for an event which we can test. I mean, I can test and do experiments to see if, the sun is responsible for the growth patterns of the plants that have the most sunlight versus the ones that are in the shade. So I can test it. Now, hypotheses, they're different from scientific theories. So a scientific theory is a tested and confirmed explanation for observations or phenomena. So a scientific theory essentially is a hypothesis that has been tested over and over and over and over and over again and has all sorts of different types of evidence to support it. So once it gets to that level, it's considered a scientific theory. So it's not something that we're planning to test. It's already been tested over and over and over again. We have a lot of evidence to support it. So for example, later in this further chapters of our textbook, we're going to talk about cell theory. So cell theory is something that has been tested over and over again. We have lots of observations and evidence to support it. In this chapter previously, in the previous video, we talked about the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So we have lots of evidence to support that theory, that scientific theory. It's already been tested over and over and confirmed over and over again. So that's considered a scientific theory level. A scientific law is, we don't really use them too much. You won't see them too much in biology, but you'll see them in the physical sciences. So a scientific law is a description, which often is a form of a mathematical formula for the behavior of some aspect of nature under certain specific conditions. So for example, later on in further chapters, I can't remember off the top of my head which chapter, we might look at the law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can just be converted from one form to another. So this is considered a scientific law because it falls under, the behavior of some aspect of nature, but we're only looking at a specific condition. So we're looking at how energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but it can be converted from one form to another. Okay, so that's considered a scientific law. And we've never been able to create energy from nothing. Okay, so we're proving this existence of this law over and over and over again. Okay, so those are, kind of three different answers to our questions. Hypothesis being an answer that we can test. Scientific theory being an answer that has been tested over and over and over again with lots of evidence to support it. Scientific law, an answer to that, but under specific conditions. And usually we don't classify them as laws in biology. They tend to be more theories. So in biology is a science that falls under the realm of natural sciences. So natural sciences, they include fields of science related to the physical world and its phenomena and its processes. So if we take a look over here in this graphic on the side, we can see some examples of natural sciences. And some of those examples fall within natural science, some are just regular old science. So for example, astronomy is a natural science. It's classified as a physical science because it relates to the physical world and its processes. Biology is certainly considered a natural science because it relates to the physical world and the phenomena and processes that are out in the world. This would be classified as a life science. Something like geology, looking at the layers of the earth and how the earth has changed over time. That would be an example of a natural science because it's relating to the physical world. And so it falls under the realm of physical science. Now, not all sciences are natural. So for example, computer science, it is a science. We're looking at computation and be able to form applications from it, but it's not based on the physical world. Okay, so it's not considered a natural science, though it is a type of science. So moving into science, when we are in the realm of science, we can come up with certain reasoning to explain something. And so this reasoning could either be inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning involves using related observations to come up with some sort of general conclusion. So we're making observations, we're recording them, and based on those observations, we're kind of coming up with some sort of conclusion. So this is more of a descriptive or discovery type of science within the realm of science. So for example, I might observe my population of squirrels in my backyard, and I notice that the squirrels, they seem to be able to jump from limb to limb with ease. I mean, I never see a squirrel just fall, right? So they seem to be very agile in the branches. They also have this big bushy tail that they, can be used to keep them warm because it gets chilly here at night. And, they seem to be looking at my bird feeder and sneaking over to the bird feeder and getting the seeds that have fallen to the ground. So they're, utilizing the food resource within my backyard. So based on all those general observations, I can come up with the conclusion that the squirrels in my backyard seem to be perfectly adapted to living here. They seem to be doing just well. They can acquire those resources that they need to survive. Okay, so I'm using my observations to come up with my general conclusion. This is the different from deductive reasoning. So in deductive reasoning, we're using some sort of general principle or law, and we're predicting specific results from it. So it tends to be more hypothesis-based science. So for example, I could take, through inductive reasoning, my conclusion that the squirrels that are in my backyard are perfectly adapted to the backyard. And based on that, I can predict something from that. I can predict that if I cut down all the trees in my backyard and cover the landscape with concrete, that the squirrels would no longer be adapted and they'd go away. So that is predicting the results. Okay, so I'm taking that general principle that they're perfectly adapted to the environment, so if the environment changes, they're no longer going to be adapted to it. And I can test that, right? I could certainly cover my landscape with concrete and see if any squirrels hang out after I've done that. So that's more hypothesis-based science, so is what we use deductive reasoning for. Okay. So based on that information, let's do a review question. So the type of logical thinking that uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion is that deductive reasoning, the scientific method, hypothesis-based science, or inductive reasoning. So if you thought inductive reasoning, I agree with you. Okay, so when we're using related observations and forming a conclusion, that's a form of inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is taking some sort of premise and predicting results from it. And it's more hypothesis-based, or it's common in hypothesis-based science. So inductive reasoning is the correct answer here. Now that last question had scientific method in its answer. So let's go ahead and learn a little bit more about the scientific method. So the scientific method consists of a series of well-defined steps. And if you take a look over on the right-hand side, we've kind of listed those steps for you. So if we look at the first step, it's making an observation. So we're humans, we're curious, we want to learn more about the area that we're in. So we might be making these observations. For example, I might make the observation that that some plants are growing better than others. And so I might ask a question. If I put fertilizer on my plants, they'll grow better. Perhaps, maybe, I don't know. So then I can come up with a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a tentative explanation for my proposed question, right? So we talked about hypotheses already. More specifically, a hypothesis must be testable and it must be falsifiable. Meaning that when I devise a hypothesis, I must be able to test the hypothesis and collect data from it. And that data will either support my hypothesis or refute it. So the hypothesis is falsifiable. We'll never have like a gray area where we can kind of accept it or not accept it. So the hypothesis must be falsifiable. I can come up with data that either supports it or refutes it. There's no gray area. So coming up with a hypothesis sometimes is a little tricky to make sure that it is testable and is falsifiable. So my hypothesis from my question might be that plants that are grown with fertilizer, that fertilizer will have an effect on them. Okay, so fertilizer has an effect on plant growth. That would be a hypothesis. It can be tested because I can grow plants with fertilizer and plants without fertilizer and see what happens. And it's falsifiable. If they grow the same, then fertilizer doesn't have an effect. So hypotheses, they must be testable and falsifiable. So once I come up with my hypothesis, then I create a prediction. So prediction is based on predicting the results of my experiment. So I'm going to kind of predict the outcome of my experiment. If I put fertilizer on the plants, then they will grow faster than the plants that don't get fertilizer. Okay, so I'm predicting the outcome of my results, okay, or my experiment. So before we actually create a prediction, usually we come up with our experimental design first so that we can kind of predict the results. So when we design an experiment, a lot of times we want to make sure that, like in a controlled experiment, that we're limiting the number of variables that will change within the experiment. So a variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change. So a lot of times we try to minimize the variation as much as possible. So for example, in my experiment, I might take a type of plant, and I might have, I don't know, 20 of those same species of plants. So they're all the same species. So I'm controlling for that. I'm not using other species in my experiment. I'm going to place them in the same type of soil. So they all have the same soil. So I'm minimizing that variation between soil types. I'm only keeping them all in the same type of soil. I'm going to water them with the same amount of water. I'm going to expose them to the same sunlight. The conditions, I'm trying to minimize the difference in them. So they're all going to be kind of grown in the same conditions. So I'm trying to limit the number of variables I'm adding to this. All those other variables like the soil type and the species of plant, the amount of water, I'm controlling for those. So those are considered standardized or controlled variables. They're all the same. So the only thing I really want to test or change in my experiment is if the plants get fertilizer or not. So when I'm developing my experiment, I might take 20 of those plants and divide them into two groups. 10 of those plants, they'll get the fertilizer. The other 10 will not. So the group that doesn't get the fertilizer is considered a control group. So control group controls every feature of contains all the features of the experimental group. Still has the same soil, the water, the sunlight that's the experimental group has, but it's not given the manipulation. It's not given the fertilizer. So I have that control group, and then I have my experimental group that gets the fertilizer. Now the reason why I want a control group is because I want to make sure it's the fertilizer that's causing these plants to grow and not something else. So that if I, conduct my experiment and I see that the control group is growing just at the same rate as the fertilizer group, then it's not the fertilizer that's causing them to grow, it's something else. So the control group is a good comparison to make sure that my results do verify that the hypothesis is supported or refuted. So once I've created kind of my experimental design, then I can, come up with my prediction that if plants are given fertilizer, they will grow faster than plants not given fertilizer. So I'm predicting the outcome. And then I conduct the experiment. So I have my experimental group and my control group. The experimental group gets the fertilizer, the control group doesn't. And then maybe over a period of a year, I take measurements of the plants as they grow and see which, collect data on the growth rate. From there, now that I've completed my experiment, I've collected all of this data, I need to categorize the data into tables, and maybe even develop some visuals so that I can see trends in data, like I could graph it. And that way I can analyze the results. So I can, use that data, look for trends, and try to figure out if I do see that the plants getting fertilizer are growing at a faster rate than the plants that are not. Now, if they are, then my data supports my hypothesis that fertilizer will affect the growth rate. And therefore, I can accept my hypothesis and then go ahead and report the results. If both groups grew at the same rate, then that means that it wasn't the fertilizer affecting their growth. So that my hypothesis is not supported. So then I have to come up with an alternative hypothesis. Okay? So that's basically looking at the scientific method. So here's a question for you. A suggested and testable explanation for an event is called what? Is it called a hypothesis, a variable, a theory, or a control? If you chose hypothesis, I would agree with you. So hypotheses, those are kind of the tentative explanations for your, what you're studying. And they're testable and falsifiable. A variable is just a change of something that varies within the experiment, something that you can change, but it's not, part of the experiment that's tested for. Theories, remember, they've already been tested over and over and over again and are supported with varied evidence. A control is just, a control group is the group that doesn't receive the treatment. A controlled variable is basically a variable that is kept consistent amongst all treatment groups. So the hypothesis is the only one that's suggested and testable explanation. Okay, so here is another visual connection question from the OpenStax textbook. So in that visual connection, we have that image that I showed you with the scientific method. And we're going to use that image to answer the questions here. So we have kind of this order of events that follows the scientific method. So number one, my toaster doesn't toast bread. Well, why doesn't my toaster work? So why doesn't my toaster work? The bread's not toasted. There's something wrong with the electrical outlet. If there's something wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also would not work if I plug it in. I plug in my coffee maker and it seems to work. So my coffee maker works. So this series of events, we're going to try to figure out which is the hypothesis and which is the prediction. So which one of these numbers would you think would be the hypothesis for this scenario? Would it be my toaster doesn't toast bread? Well, my toaster not toasting bread is not really testable because it's already done, right? Why doesn't my toaster? Well, that's the question work, so that's the question there. There is something wrong with the electrical outlet. Is this testable? Yeah, I can test it, right? I can see if other things plugged in, if it works. It's falsifiable because if I plug something else in and it works, then it's not the electrical outlet. So this is the hypothesis here. Well, if this is the hypothesis, then the next one must be the prediction. If something is wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work when plugged in. Now you'll notice that there's a difference between a hypothesis here and a prediction. So the hypothesis is just explaining the question that we have. So why doesn't my toaster work? There must be something wrong with the electrical outlet. Whereas a prediction is actually predicting the results. If something's wrong with the outlet, my coffee maker is not going to work when I plug it in either. So it's predicting the results. So those are the difference between the two. So now we have this last question. Based on the results, is the hypothesis supported? So the hypothesis we've already identified as there's something wrong with the electrical outlet. But if we look further in our list here, it says number 5, I plug in my coffee maker into the outlet, and then number 6, my coffee maker works. So based on that result, does that validate my hypothesis or does it refute it? Well, if my coffee maker works just fine, if I plug it in, then it's not the outlet that's the problem. So that is the one. So basically our hypothesis is not supported. So based on that, if it's not supported, then I have to come up with an alternate hypothesis. Maybe my toaster just doesn't work anymore. Maybe it's broken. Maybe some component came loose. Okay, so we answered all of these questions. So now that we have an understanding of science and the scientific method, and we know what life sciences are versus physical science, and we know what natural sciences are, let's go back and look at science in general. So when we look at science, we can use we can look at it as basic science or as applied science. So the difference between the two is that basic science, also known as pure science, that's where a scientist is just kind of trying to expand knowledge regardless of any application it might have for the future. So for example, I like to look at squirrels in my backyard because they're basically, they're pretty funny looking at. They do all these weird things and they're cute and everything. So I might just seek to learn more about them just because I want to. So that's an example of basic science. So we're just learning about something because we want to, regardless of any short-term application that it can be useful for something. Applied science, there's a reason why we're doing it, okay? So it aims to use science to solve immediate problems, so something that's been defined by the researcher. So for example, if, I just had a huge snowstorm blew through, and if it happened to be nesting season, it could have blown those baby squirrels out of their nest. And so I might use science to, figure out how to keep these little babies survived without their mom, for a little bit of time to rehabilitate them to the point where they can survive on their own. So I'm using applied science in that sense. I have a problem and I'm trying to solve it, and I'm using science to solve it. So when we're thinking about basic science and applied science, sometimes they can be used in conjunction with each other. So for example, we have here in our figure on the right, the Human Genome Project. So the Human Genome Project was a 13-year collaborative effort among researchers working in several different fields of science. So the project, we sequenced the entire human genome, and that was completed in 2003. So, well, that's kind of a both type of science applied there. So we wanted to be able to sequence the entire human genome just because we want to, be able to just understand humans more. So we can think of it as basic science. But it's also useful for a number of things. If we know the genetic sequence of a certain gene, if somebody has a mutation of that gene that leads to some sort of genetic disease, then maybe we can figure out how to help them. So there's an applied sense to this project as well. So basic science, we're just acquiring knowledge through science without any short-term application. Like we just looked at the entire genome. Well, a lot of it we haven't used since then, but it also has an application to it. We can sequence a certain gene that might lead to a genetic disease, and maybe that we can figure out some sort of medication to help support individuals with that mutation, or maybe we can do some sort of gene therapy that allows us to alter that gene so that it works in the normal sense and allows the human to survive. I don't know. So basic versus applied. Okay. And then finally, we're going to talk about the process of science. So when the Human Genome Project was completed, we didn't just sit on it, right, and not publish our results. So, we have to notify everybody. And so the way that scientists communicate with and get their information out there is a process known as publication through peer review. So peer review is, it's a lot different than, say, if I just wanted to do an experiment about my squirrels in the backyard and just post it in a blog post somewhere. Okay, that's not peer reviewed. So scientific process involves this process of publication involves this process of peer review. And this peer review process is pretty intense for something to be published in scientific journals. So it involves a blind process where scientists submit the details of their experiments, results, and interpretations, and reviewers then determine the veracity and merit of their work for publication. So this, again, it's a pretty intense process. So a scientist, when they've, performed some sort of experiment and they want their results published, they have to make sure that their experiment, the details of their experiment makes sense, that it's valid, that they didn't mess up somewhere. So that's why we have a group of experts that actually look through the experimental design of that scientist and decide, well, you forgot to do a hypothesis, or your hypothesis really isn't testable. So they will catch those little mistakes so that the piece of the, whatever the scientist has done doesn't get published. They also look at the results and interpretations of the results to make sure that there were no errors along the way, or that the interpretation, it has to be based on the data that was collected, not something else. And so, that peer review process is very extensive, and it's conducted so that when a scientific paper is published in a scientific publication, that it's considered unbiased and, it's solid, that all the mistakes have been accounted for and so forth. So it's a lot different from just publishing something in a blog or something like that. Now, one way that you can recognize if it's a scientific article or if it's just like something else is that scientific articles, they have a typical format to them. They have an abstract, which is kind of a summary. They include an introduction, which includes background research. They have an extensive method section stating exactly what they did to collect the data. They have a results section, which usually presents the data in a table format or graph, and the scientist kind of describes the trends that they see. A discussion section, which actually interprets that data and uses other sources, other scientist research to kind of validate their results. And then an extensive literature cited section, which includes the full references of every piece of research that they have used from other sources. So that's a lot different than, say, me opening up the newspaper and reading an article from a newspaper. So that's not a scientific journal article. A magazine article from something that sounds scientific, like Scientific America, that's a secondary source. We actually usually don't include the literature cited section and method section in that. They're just reporting something that's already been published in a scientific journal and kind of summarizing it in an easier way. So peer review, very extensive process used in order for us scientists to be able to publish our results in some sort of scientific journal. So I've basically covered the second half of Chapter 1, Introduction of Biology, in this video. For those of you that haven't had a chance to look at the first section, again, I did that in a previous video, so feel free to take a look at that. If you continue to like my videos, I will be posting more of them of each of the different chapters in the same manner, where I include kind of a lecture as well as some of those review questions. So if you don't want to miss out on any of those new videos that I post, so go ahead and click that subscribe button.